You already know what you should be doing. That's not the problem. You know the work you've been avoiding. You know the decisions you keep delaying. You know the version of your life that exists just on the other side of consistent action. And yet, somehow, you don't move. So you explain it the only way that seems to make sense. You tell yourself you need more discipline, more motivation, more focus. That explanation feels accurate. It even sounds responsible, but it's not what's actually happening. Because if this were a discipline problem, then knowing what to do would be enough to at least start. And you don't just fail to finish. Sometimes you don't even begin. That gap between knowing and doing, that's the part most people never truly understand. They try to fix it by pushing harder, by forcing consistency, by blaming themselves when it doesn't work. But the harder they push, the more resistance they feel. And eventually, they arrive at a quiet conclusion they don't say out loud. Maybe I'm just not that kind of person. Pause there. Because that thought, that subtle shift from behavior to identity, that's where everything starts to go wrong. Not at the level of action, but at the level of interpretation. You're not stuck because you're lazy. You're not inconsistent because you lack discipline. You're stuck because you're running a system that was never designed to produce the outcome you want. And the problem is, you didn't consciously build that system. It was installed. Slowly. Quietly. Over time. Through experiences, feedback, failure, expectations, all shaping the way you interpret what happens to you. So now, when you sit down to do something difficult, you think you're making a decision, but you're not. The reaction is already in motion. You open your laptop. You tell yourself, this time I'll focus. And for a moment, it feels real. Then something subtle happens. The task becomes slightly unclear, or slightly difficult, or slightly uncomfortable. Nothing dramatic, just enough. And then, almost automatically, your attention shifts. You check something. You delay starting. You tell yourself you'll come back to it. And just like that, the moment is gone. No clear decision. No conscious choice to quit. It just happens. That's the part most people miss. Because from the outside, it looks like inaction. But from the inside, it feels justified. It feels reasonable. It feels like, I'll do it later. I just need to think first. I'm not in the right state right now. And those thoughts don't feel like resistance. They feel like logic. But they're not neutral. They're outputs. Outputs of a system that is already running. A system that has one primary objective. Not success. Not growth. Not expansion. Safety. Your mind is not trying to make you successful. It's trying to make you safe. And those are not the same thing. Because growth requires exposure, uncertainty, failure, all the things your system has been trained to avoid. So when you move towards something that matters, you don't just encounter difficulty, you trigger protection. And that protection doesn't show up as fear in the way you expect. It doesn't always feel like panic or anxiety. Sometimes it feels like hesitation, distraction, overthinking, delay. And because it doesn't feel like fear, you don't recognize it as resistance. You interpret it as a signal that something is off, that maybe this isn't for you, that maybe you're not ready, that maybe you should wait. But that signal isn't telling you the truth. It's telling you what keeps you safe. There's a difference. And until you see that difference clearly, you'll keep trying to fix your behavior without realizing that your behavior is the result, not the cause. So the real question isn't, how do I become more disciplined? The real question is, what system is producing this pattern over and over again? Because once you see that, everything starts to shift. Not immediately, not dramatically, but precisely. You stop blaming yourself for outcomes and start examining the structure behind them. You start noticing patterns that used to feel invisible. The moments you hesitate, the moments you avoid, the moments you quietly step back from something you said mattered. And at first, it's uncomfortable. Because you realize something you didn't want to admit, you haven't been choosing these outcomes. You've been following them. Automatically. Consistently. Predictably. And that realization leads to a deeper question. If this is a system, then what exactly is it optimizing for? Because it's clearly not optimizing for success. So what is it protecting? What is it trying to avoid? And more importantly, what happens the moment you try to move against it? What happens the moment you try to move against it is the part that has been quietly controlling everything. Because that's where the system reveals itself. Not when things are easy, not when you're comfortable, but at the exact point where effort becomes required. That moment, that subtle shift from, I can do this, to maybe I should wait. That's not random. That's the system activating. And if you slow it down just enough to observe it, you'll notice something precise. It doesn't stop you directly. It doesn't say, don't do this. It changes what the situation means. The task is no longer just a task. It becomes a test, a judgment, a potential exposure. And once that shift happens, your behavior follows automatically. You hesitate, you delay, you redirect your attention. Not because you chose to fail, but because the meaning changed. And meaning drives response. Always. This is the part most people never isolate. They try to control action without realizing that action is downstream of interpretation. So they push harder. They try to override the hesitation. Force movement. Force discipline. But force doesn't rewrite meaning. It only creates friction, and friction doesn't last. Eventually, the system reasserts itself. Because it's not weak, it's consistent. It has been reinforced over and over again. Every time you avoided something difficult and felt relief. Every time you stepped back and reduced discomfort. Every time you told yourself, later, and escaped the pressure of now. That relief wasn't neutral. It was reinforcement. It told your system, this is the correct response. So the next time a similar situation appears, the reaction is faster, cleaner, more automatic, until eventually, it doesn't feel like a reaction at all. It feels like who you are, and that's where it becomes dangerous. Because once a pattern feels like identity, you stop questioning it. You stop examining it. You stop seeing it as something that can change. You just accept it. I'm not consistent. I'm not disciplined. I'm not that kind of person. But those statements, they're not observations. They're conclusions. Conclusions drawn from patterns that were never properly understood. You weren't born avoiding difficulty. You learned to interpret difficulty in a specific way. And once that interpretation was installed, everything else followed. So when you think about rewiring your mind, what you're actually talking about is not changing what you do. It's changing what things mean. Because meaning is the trigger. Meaning is the switch. Meaning is what determines whether you move forward or step back. Take a simple moment. You start something new. At first, there's energy, clarity, momentum. Then, inevitably, it gets harder. The progress slows. The results aren't immediate. The outcome becomes uncertain. That's the moment. And in that moment, your system asks a question, not consciously, but structurally. What does this mean? If your system interprets that difficulty as this is proof I'm not good at this, then stopping makes sense. If it interprets it as, this is where most people fail, then avoidance feels logical. If it interprets it as, this might expose my limitations, then stepping back feels safe. And you don't experience that as fear, you experience it as reasoning. That's why it's so effective, because it doesn't feel like sabotage, it feels like clarity. But it's not clarity, it's conditioning. And once you see that, you start to notice it everywhere. Not just in big decisions, but in small, almost invisible moments. You open a document and pause. You think about making a call and delay. You consider starting and hesitate. And each time, there's a thought. Quick, subtle, easy to miss. But it's there. And that thought carries meaning. Not objective meaning, constructed meaning. And that meaning determines everything that follows. So if you want to change your behavior, you don't start with behavior. You start by catching that moment, that exact point where meaning is assigned. Because that's where the system is most exposed, not when you fail, But right before you decide what failure means, that's the opening, that's the leverage point, and most people move past it too quickly to see it. They react before they observe. They interpret before they question. They follow the pattern before they understand it. So nothing changes. The same triggers produce the same meanings. The same meanings produce the same responses. And the same responses produce the same outcomes, over and over again. Different days, same structure. But once you slow it down, even slightly, something shifts. You begin to separate the event from the interpretation. You begin to see that what you thought was automatic is actually constructed. And if it's constructed, it can be changed. Not instantly, not effortlessly, but deliberately. And that's where rewiring actually begins. Not with force, not with motivation, but with awareness. Precise awareness. The kind that doesn't just notice what you do, but understands why it feels right in the moment. Because if you can see that clearly, if you can isolate the meaning that's driving the response, then for the first time you're not just reacting to the system, you're observing it. And once you can observe it, you can interrupt it. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to create something different. And that difference, as small as it seems, is where the entire process starts to shift. And that shift, that small interruption, is where most people make a critical mistake. They see the pattern. They recognize the hesitation. They understand, at least intellectually, what's happening. And then they try to fix it immediately. They try to replace the old response with the right one, force themselves to act, push through resistance, override the system. But that approach carries the same flaw as before. It focuses on behavior without fully resolving meaning. Because even if you act, if the meaning hasn't changed, the system hasn't changed. You've just temporarily gone against it. And temporary resistance doesn't create lasting rewiring. It creates exhaustion. This is why people have moments of discipline, but not consistency. Moments where they push through only to fall back into the same pattern later. Because the system was never actually updated. It was challenged, but not redefined. So the real question becomes, how do you change meaning? Not in theory, not as an idea, but in a way your system actually accepts. Because your mind doesn't change based on what you hear. It changes based on what it experiences repeatedly. That distinction matters a lot. You can understand something perfectly and still not act differently. Because understanding is not evidence. And your system doesn't run on understanding. It runs on proof, consistent proof, emotional proof, experiential proof. So if you've spent years reinforcing the idea that struggle means I'm not good enough, you don't undo that by saying struggle is part of growth. That's not enough. That's a statement, not evidence. And without evidence, the old meaning stays dominant. So instead of trying to think differently, you have to start responding differently in small, controlled ways long enough for your system to update. This is where most people lose patience, because the change feels slow, subtle, almost invisible at first. But that's exactly how real rewiring works. Not through dramatic shifts, but through consistent contradiction of the old pattern. Let's go back to that moment. You start something. It gets difficult. The thought appears, maybe this isn't for me. That's the old meaning activating. Now, this time, you don't immediately follow it. You pause. Not for long. Just enough to notice. This is the pattern. That alone is different. Before, the thought and the reaction were fused. Now there's a gap. Small, but real. And inside that gap, you introduce a new interpretation. Not something exaggerated. Not something forced. Something precise. Something believable. This difficulty doesn't mean I'm not capable. It means I'm at the edge of what I currently know. That's it. No hype, no motivation, just a shift in meaning. And then you act. Not perfectly, not intensely, just enough to stay engaged a little longer than you normally would. That action combined with the new meaning creates a different experience. And that experience is what your system pays attention to. Not the thought, not the intention, the outcome. You stayed. You didn't collapse immediately. You moved slightly past the point where you usually stop. And nothing broke. That matters. Because now, the next time that moment appears, the system has conflicting data. The old pattern says, stop. This means something is wrong. But now there's a new reference point. Last time, I stayed, and it was fine. That tension between old meaning and new evidence is where rewiring accelerates. Not because you forced change, but because you introduced contradiction. And if you repeat that process not perfectly, but consistently, the balance starts to shift. Slowly at first, then more noticeably. The hesitation is still there, but it weakens. The reaction still appears, but it's less convincing. And eventually, the meaning itself begins to change. Not because you told it to, but because it no longer matches your experience. This is the part most people never reach. Because they either give up too early or try to force too much, too fast. But rewiring doesn't respond to intensity. It responds to consistency. Small corrections, repeated over time, each one subtle, each one reinforcing a new interpretation. Until the new meaning becomes the default. And when that happens, the behavior changes without force. You don't have to push yourself as hard. You don't have to argue with your thoughts, because the thoughts themselves are different. The same situation appears, but it no longer triggers the same response. That's when you know something has actually changed. Not when you feel motivated, not when you have a good day, but when the pattern itself begins to break. Quietly, naturally, without effort. And that leads to something most people overlook. You don't need to become a different person to produce different results. You need to run a different system, because who you think you are has always been a reflection of the patterns you've been repeating. And once those patterns change, identity follows, not the other way around. So the goal isn't to convince yourself that you're capable. The goal is to create enough evidence that your system has no choice but to update. And that only happens one way. You meet the same moment with a different response, long enough for it to become real. Not imagined, not hoped for, proven. And this is where most people misunderstand what proof actually means. They think it has to be something big, a major win, a visible result. Something that clearly shows, now I've changed. But your system doesn't update based on scale. It updates based on consistency of experience. Small moments, repeated enough times until they stop feeling like exceptions. That's what turns a new response into a new pattern. So when you stay focused for 5 extra minutes, that counts. When you don't immediately escape discomfort, that counts. When you catch the thought and don't obey it automatically, that counts. Individually, these moments feel insignificant, but to your system, they are data. And data accumulates, quietly, without you noticing at first, until one day, something subtle happens. You enter a situation that used to trigger hesitation, and the hesitation is still there, but weaker. Less convincing, less absolute. You don't fully believe it anymore. That's the shift. Not the absence of resistance, but the loss of its authority. Because before, when the thought appeared, it felt final, like a conclusion. Now, it feels like a suggestion. Something you can question, something you can override without force. And that difference changes everything. Because once a thought loses authority, it no longer controls behavior automatically. You regain space. Space to choose. Space to respond. Space to act. Even when the old pattern is still present. And that's what real control looks like. Not the elimination of difficulty, but the ability to move through it without collapsing into it. At this point, something else begins to shift. Your relationship with failure. Before, failure felt heavy, personal, final, something that said something about you. Now it starts to feel different, more neutral, more specific. Less about who you are and more about what happened. You try something and it doesn't work. And instead of, this proves I'm not good at this, the interpretation becomes, this shows me what doesn't work yet. That word yet changes the entire structure of the experience. It keeps the door open. It removes finality. It turns failure from a verdict into information. And once failure becomes information, it stops being something you need to avoid, which means you stop protecting yourself from it, which means you stop avoiding the very situations that create growth. And that's when the system truly begins to rewire. Because now, you're no longer just tolerating difficulty, you're using it, actively, intentionally, as feedback. This is exactly what Carol S. Dweck identified when she studied how people respond to challenge. Two individuals can face the exact same situation, the same difficulty, the same setback, the same failure, and walk away with completely different outcomes. Not because of talent, not because of intelligence, but because of interpretation. One sees limitation, the other sees expansion. One withdraws, the other adapts. And over time, that difference compounds. Not dramatically at first, but predictably, until the gap becomes undeniable. And from the outside, it looks like one person is naturally better, more capable, more driven. But what you're actually seeing is the result of two different systems, running for a long time, producing exactly what they were designed to produce. So when you look at someone who seems consistent, focused, disciplined, you're not looking at someone who is constantly forcing themselves to act. You're looking at someone whose interpretations support action. That's the difference. Their system doesn't trigger the same level of resistance, not because they don't feel discomfort, but because discomfort doesn't mean the same thing to them. It doesn't signal danger. It signals progress. And once that shift happens, consistency stops feeling like effort. It becomes the default. But this is where you need to be precise. Because it's easy to hear this and turn it into another abstract idea, another concept you understand but don't apply. So bring it back to something real. The next time you're about to avoid something, don't think about changing your life. Don't think about success. Don't think about becoming a different person. That's too far, too abstract. Focus on the moment, the exact moment where the pattern usually takes over. You feel the hesitation, the urge to delay, the subtle pull to step away. And instead of reacting immediately, pause, just long enough to ask, what does this mean right now? Not in general, not philosophically, specifically. What meaning are you assigning to this difficulty? Is it, this is too much for me? Or is it, this is where I grow? That question asked at the right time interrupts the automatic response. It creates a gap. And inside that gap, you choose the interpretation. Not perfectly, not always, but intentionally. And then you act just slightly differently than you normally would. That's it. No dramatic shift, no complete transformation, just a small deviation from the pattern. But if you repeat that again and again, those small deviations stop being exceptions. They become the new structure. And once the structure changes, the outcomes follow. Naturally, predictably, without force. Because you're no longer fighting the system, you've updated it. And that leads to the final realization, the one most people never fully accept. You were never lacking discipline. You were never fundamentally flawed. You were responding exactly the way your system was designed to respond. The problem was never you. It was the interpretation you learned to trust. And once you change that, once you see difficulty, failure, and effort differently, you don't just act differently, you become different. Not because you tried to be, but because the system that defines your behavior is no longer the same. And at that point, the question isn't, can you succeed? That question doesn't even make sense anymore. The real question is, what system are you running? Because that answer, more than anything else, determines everything that follows.